Since this week is Passover and Holy Week, I thought we'd skip ahead to chapter 16, which is about springtime, in which those events are mentioned. Before we get started, here is a picture of the vines during bud break, so you can see a bit what they look like there. That's a Grenache vine. And here are some pictures of some of the Tempranillo vines in spring as well. And I happened to find this wonderful picture of Bluey the dog when he was about 1 or 2 years old in the springtime of his youth. So here we are, chapter 16 of About That Wine I Gave You. Chapter 16, Springtime in the Vineyard. All the rain that falls in winter is sucked through roots into the vines, and pruning is a signal to wake from dormant slumber and start their engines. Spring, summer, fall, winter. A year is a lifetime for the grape. Birth, childhood, adulthood, death. The annual cycle of life commences as winter's water, nutrients, and life force surge from the earth through the trunk to the dead ends of cordon arms, against the dead ends of cul-de-sac buds, and probe for an escape. And like a volcano with rising lava, pressure builds, soft lava pressing, pushing, and after pruning, there are no long canes, no branches for that flow to go, and buds start to swell, imitating a pussy willow's furry catkins, a rising dome of sleepwalking volcano. Marine helicopters from Camp Pendleton circle above, reconnoitering the growing dome. Will Mount St. Helens explode again? Until the inevitable happens. One pops. The first pop of popcorn. Pop, pop, pop. Second and third rounds of popping as corn warms over the fire. And soon there is machine gun popping, chainsaw, weed whacker, sputtering, engine of popping. Pop, 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 pop. Welcome to Bud Break in the Vineyard. The first shoot emerges. A lonely shoot, a pioneer, sparking a celebration among the vintners at the first sign of spring. Beware the grasshoppers, they're celebrating too. The first shoots of spring, the first pops of popcorn, will give way to summer when small shoots grow into a forest. A new spring, a new year, a new vintage. Opening day, April Fools. This could become the best wine ever, all contained within a tiny bud of a dormant vine. Although the marriage between Sheila and Paul was flatter than leftover champagne, their relationship with the vines was renewed each March, as exciting as their honeymoon. Same time each year, same time next year, as buds swelled, then spewed green shoots from barren arms. The couple stayed together for the vines as much as for the sake of their dog. Freshly unfurled leaves are as miraculous and delicate as a newborn's hands, admired and awed by parents, and treated with as much care and attention. Primordial instincts reawakened, focused on the vines. Weeds and grasses pushing up from the dampened earth are, like the leaves above, a light shade of Kelly green and host to ladybugs and other beneficial insects. There is no mildew. The vines are under control, and a pair of swallows, exhausted from their flight over the Pacific, return to their mud nest on the side of the house above the watchful eyes of Bluey. For all the comments and complaints about how much work it takes to manage a vineyard during the annual spring honeymoon, all is forgiven. Some tasks become easier as vines mature. With thoughtful pruning, they're easier to control, with fewer shoots to thin. As baby grapes emerge, there's hope. The wine they produce will be great, even if the marriage wasn't. Bluey enjoyed spring because it was the start of gopher season, and he stayed by the hole after Paul set a trap, waiting for a tug on the line with the patience of a seasoned fisherman. A baby squirrel ventured out to inspect the gopher fisher and found himself inside the dog's jaws. Paul found a wide-eyed Bluey with a squirrel pup unharmed and commanded, "Leave it!" Paul scooped up the stunned squirrel with his shovel and carried it to the Valley of Death to finish the job. The shovel and the guillotine never failed. If Bluey wasn't sure what to do with the pulsating bead of live squirrel meat in his mouth, he knew what to do with the mouse, as enjoyable for him as biting into Xiaolong baozi was for Paul, with warm blood squirting into the dog's mouth instead of soup from hot dumplings. A fresh mouse for the dog was equivalent to sweet tarts, Hershey's Kisses, and lickety-split putang, and Paul was happy to see a decrease in the surplus mouse population. Fewer mice in the field meant fewer mice in the winery, as Sheila persisted in opening the garage door to allow in fresh air, as adventurous rodents to enter. The thought of dumplings triggered Paul's memory of Christine, who showed him how to eat this delicacy without burning his tongue. He taught her a new way to savor them when he ordered room service the next morning, inserted one of the steaming grenades into his mouth, the hot soup exploding from his mouth into hers when their lips connected. Whatever happened to her? He went back to work, picking up bundles of cut canes. He threw the thickest for Bluey to fetch, slung the remainders over his back, and carried his burden down the hill. Thinning shoots is an infinite loop. Start at the bottom of the vineyard and work your way to the top, then repeat from the bottom. Look for vines gathering into a mini jungle. Create airflow. Look for a shoot without a cluster. Remove it, unless you need that shoot next year, because next year's grapes come from this year's shoots. A chess game. Vineyarding is carrying a shovel and walking from vine to vine, cutting a weed here, thinning a shoot there, managing by exception, and that's what the couple did. Paul simplified his naming of vines. There were vines named after Richard and Carrie Ann, and my favorite vine, which seemed to change from year to year, as did his favorite moose. So he had a stable of favorites. Sheila gave every vine a name and talked to each as she passed. Good boy, good girl, grow nice and big for Mama. The vines became her adopted children, as her begotten ones wanted nothing to do with the vineyard. On a 6-foot cordon, the general goal was to thin to 2 shoots per spur, occasionally 3, about 16 shoots per vine, plus or minus, with 1 or 2 clusters per shoot, depending on the vine. The aim was to grow the appropriate amount of grapes for that particular vine, depending on its girth and vigor. Paul constantly reminded Miguel, who bragged about growing the most grapes at Joe's, "We're trying to grow great wine, not more grapes." Early in the season, Paul avoided removing any excess shoots with grapes. Who knew? You might need them after all. Tempranillo leaves were large, and if growth was excessive, Paul snipped the leaf below the cluster, sometimes clipping the leaf above the cluster to open up space. Don't let green grapes get too much sun or they'll burn and shrivel. Find another shoot with no grapes. There's one. Are you sure? Yes. Off with their heads. Ah! There's a spot with 4 shoots. 2 shoots are ideal here. Who stays? Who goes? Who has fruit? Who doesn't? Who has more fruit? Who has a better looking cluster? No fruit? Off with their heads. Schlagen Sie tot! It took a week, sometimes 2, to thin the vineyard, husband, wife, and dog, vineyardista, y Piero, bottom to top, and when finished, they celebrated with a bottle of wine as the sun set. Then, as they looked upon the vines at the bottom where they started, they saw a creeping jungle reaching up, extending its arms, and it was time to go back and thin again. Work never ends in a vineyard. Different this round were baby birds chirping in the vines, and they left shoots around each nest to shield it from predators. If Bluey discovered the nest, the chick's life expectancy was drastically reduced. He wouldn't harm a baby rabbit whom he thought of as a puppy, but birds he liked to chomp. So did Carl Rove, the neighbor's cat, who delighted in chewing the heads off yellow-bellied orioles. The vintners were compelled to keep thinning, to open up the canopy so air could pass through freely, as a defense against mildew guys. At dusk, Paul kept working, while Sheila returned to the house to feed Bluey and open a bottle of wine. After the sun dipped behind Catalina Island, reflecting the mirror surface of a placid ocean, in the lingering light, Paul was cautious not to cut any shoots with a grape cluster, unless a particular patch was just too congested. He dropped fresh tender shoots to the ground to feed rabbits, who cautiously approached, as they detected Bluey, who returned to watch Paul, but became distracted by the rabbits he chased for sport. "Look, snip, pull, drop, shoot to the ground. Next. Check for grapes. Snip, pull, make a pile. Snip, pull." "Fuck," cursed Paul, as he saw an embryonic grape cluster attached to a vine he cut by accident. What if a surgeon did that? To avoid more mistakes in the darkness, he called Bluey, and they walked to the house as rabbits emerged to gorge on the smorgasbord left behind. A few days later, the Vineyardista discovered remains from the rabbit's feast, cursing at the bare bones left behind, stripped by furry piranhas, shoots now stiff as sticks that pierced her black plastic bag. "If you had to pay me, you wouldn't leave the cuttings behind," she sang to Paul, who replied he was feeding the rabbits who fertilized the vineyard, and he walked over to another block, the vines absorbing the music of Sheila's admonitions, filtering them into sweet wine. The magic of vines in spring. He trimmed the vines, but not his hair, which grew out during the growing season. At the end of a weekend with 3 days stubble, caked dirt covering his body, tattered clothes, and long hair, he resembled a wild man from the jungle. People looked like their dogs, and Paul became Bluey's twin, with a blue and white tinged beard. Eventually, Paul would become fed up with his straggly hair and take electric clippers to his scalp and buzz it all off. When you work dawn to dusk in a vineyard, there's no such things as germs and bad haircuts. He was so exhausted, he didn't care. Down the hill and across the road, the cougar knelt in rich, moist dirt and dug. Sweat dripped from pores, emanating the essence of earth, and she produced the earthiest wines in the county. She was an earth goddess, tolling the land by hand, digging holes and planting more vines, along with succulents and even a vegetable garden, and her wines were a reflection of her wholesomeness. Owlets in their nest at night sound a continuous homing signal of baby squawks, evenly spaced like the ticking of a clock, squeaks containing the miniature voice print of future adult screeches that are as natural as exhaling and provide a target for the parents to return with food. Almost unaware, or are they stupid, rabbits graze in the open 50 feet from the base of the pole where the owl's nest is located. What are they thinking? Rabbits must be suicidal, always jumping under the wheels of speeding cars, unlike squirrels who have the good sense to run away. Rabbits have lost their brains from too much procreation. Too much sex makes you tired and stupid. Love like a rabbit, and you'll walk off the sidewalk right into a car, or worse, plant a vineyard. Stupid rabbits, thought Paul as he drove through the hidden hills at night on his way home from work, they playing dodgeball with his car's tires. Fucking rabbits, said Miguel, when he saw infant vines he planted at a new vineyard stripped of shoots and leaves. To prepare his spirit for Easter, Paul picked up the heavy wooden cross at the top of the hill and carried it like a baby in his arms to the bottom. From there, he dragged it along each row, following an imagined Via Dolorosa, all the way to the top to a spot he named Golgotha, for there was a peak of boulders where he placed the cross and draped it with black cloth. "What are you doing?" Sheila asked. "It's Good Friday," he answered. "Are you crazy? It's so embarrassing. What if the neighbors see you?" "I'll ask them to join me, and we'll take turns carrying the cross." She huffed and marched to her side of the vineyard, calling Bluey to join her. But he stayed by the side of the lamb, infuriating her more, while Paul decided to invite the neighbors next year. The following spring, since Paul had been spending more time Sundays working in the vineyard and less time going to church, as Easter approached, he decided to partake in the Christian obligations of Holy Week and attend all the services, which begin on Palm Sunday. He cutting 24 long palm fronds he placed by the church's entrance. The Thursday service is called Maundy Thursday, and Paul drove to church and sat in a pew near the back. The bishop himself, making a visitation to Paul's church, invited the congregation to have their feet washed by the clergy and to wash the feet of one another. Paul got into the line and was surprised to see a woman with the aurora of Mary Magdalene waiting by the water basin to clean his feet. He blushed, because she radiated beautiful innocence, while Paul had the foulest feet in all of San Diego, at least the ugliest toenails his dermatologist had ever seen, who on each visit prescribed a cream to kill the fungus. The doctor finally prescribed an oral medicine Paul refused, because the last thing he was going to do was take medication to improve his cosmetic appearance. He was beyond vanity when it came to toenails and hair. If ugly toenails and baldness were the worst that would happen as he aged, Paul took a silent, deep breath and lifted his left foot for Mary to wash. She paused, not saying a word, then poured water over his feet and gently lathered his ugly duckling dogs, reminding Paul of the reflexology foot massage given to him after arriving by international flight by Christine, who, after restoring his feet, massaged the rest of his travel-weary body, followed by a happy ending. I wonder what she's doing, Paul thought, humbled by the loving gesture of his fellow parishioner and the memory of his iniquities. The bishop walked to a man sitting in the back row of the South Transept and whispered in his ear. The man took off his boots, stood up tall, and followed the bishop to the altar. Paul recognized the man, one of the day laborers from his neighborhood. The bishop washed the man's feet, and afterwards proclaimed, "As I have washed your feet, and you have washed each other's, go forth and care for your neighbors." As Paul walked to the parking lot after the service, the bishop greeted him. "Good to see you. How are the vines?" "Wonderful, growing like weeds," said Paul. "Father, that man you spoke with in the pews, was that Rodrigo?" "I don't know his name. What did you say to him?" "Todos son bienvenidos aquí." All are welcome here. As Paul drove through the hidden hills, he saw lights on at Carrie Ann's and stopped by to check on her Easter plans and invite her to the cross-carrying ceremony. He told her about the foot washing and asked, as a milquetoast expression of evangelism, "Have you ever done that in church?" "That's disgusting." "It's an act of love. Even the Pope washes the feet of the people, and our bishop the feet of day laborers." And what did that woman say when she saw your feet? "I've seen your feet, and that's why I don't let you walk barefoot in my house or Vineyard." I warned her I have the ugliest feet she was about to see, and assured her my penis is a work of art sculpted by Michelangelo. "Oh, you shut up. You didn't." "No, I didn't. But that's what I tell you if you wash my feet. You dirty old man. I'm younger than you. And my feet are dirty, but your heart is pure." "Right," she replied. She said she'd invite Steph and John to the ceremony. The next day at 5 p.m., neighbors gathered below Paul's house so the sun and temperature sank. "How are you going to feed all those people?" Sheila asked. "We have wine and bread and cheese." "You never plan anything properly. You can't invite people over without feeding them. There's plenty of food. I'm going shopping." And as the last guests arrived, she sped down the mountain to the local deli to buy bread, fruit, and pizza. The neighbors walked the Stations of the Cross along a Via Dolorosa created by Paul, stopping at posts along the way with wooden carvings nailed to them depicting scenes of Jesus' route. The pilgrims read from a liturgy the altar guild ladies printed for Paul, and as they moved to the next station, Bluey, in sheep herding mode, led the way barking, then circled to the rear to bring up stragglers. Carrie Ann brought a cheese platter and Merlot Mac a cooked crock-pot, and after the ceremony, as the pilgrims chattered at the ridge on the hill, admiring the setting sun, Paul and Carrie Ann went down to the kitchen to bring up the food with bottles of wine. Paul broke into a hearty Santa laugh when she saw Sheila get out of the car with pizza and 3 pounds of seedless green grapes. "Why did you buy grapes?" he asked. "I thought everyone missed them." Indeed, it had been 6 months since the winemakers had tasted fresh grapes, and they enjoyed each one, and no one went home hungry. Steph, who arrived in time for the food, marched to the top of the vineyard in high heels looking for John, who arrived on his mule. not the symbol of Palm Sunday, but the M274, the rugged all-terrain munitions vehicle he reassembled from Army surplus parts. He could drive anywhere, even along the hills of Blue Merle Mountain, with Bluey leading the way, barking and clearing a path. "I need a truck," Sheila told Paul. "When are you going to buy me a gator?" "When do you want to die?" he replied. "The hills are too steep. You'll flip over and crush yourself." The next year, as Easter approached, Paul was so busy tending the vines, he put off organizing a Stations of the Cross service for the neighbors. On Easter morning, Sheila asked, "Aren't you going to church?" "No, I want to stay here with you." "Liar. I'm going to work in the vineyard." "You can worship there," she said. Paul walked to the cave where a giant boulder blocked the entrance. He peeked inside and saw it was empty. He climbed to the cross over the cave and draped a white silk sheet over the crossbeam. He began going to church less and less, and at the urging of the vines, spent more time with them Sundays. Yet every Good Friday, he carried the cross with Bluey from the bottom of the vineyard to the top, reciting, "This vineyard is the cross I carry, and caring for the vines is my penance." Paul weeded and pulled leaves and left a trail behind him, visible to the vineyardista, who asked, "Could you please pick those up?" She pointed to where he had been working. "Look at my rows. See the neat piles of leaves? These are easier to pick up." "I'm leaving food for the rabbits." "The rabbits can eat from piles. You don't have to leave everything scattered everywhere." "I'm leaving behind organic material for the vineyard." "The leaves don't go into the ground." "That's because you're always raking them up." "Because you leave a mess. I want a clean vineyard. If you'd stop watering lilac, sumac, and oaks when they're young, I won't have to cut them down when they're big. I want to grow trees to hide the neighbor's house. That's fine, but don't plant trees next to our house. It's a fire hazard. Don't stop me." And the vicious cycle of her growing weeds into bushes, into trees, into fire threats that needed trimming spun round and round. She continued singing a song about her vines and her vineyard as Paul continued shoot-thinning down the row, further and further away from her, her words clouded by the songs of vines. At that moment, the irresistible sounds of giggling, playing children, and he joined their games and continued working until he couldn't tell if a shoot had a grape or not because it was too dark. "What's for dinner?" she asked. "Wine," he answered, too tired to cook. They went inside, opened a bottle, and before crashing, Paul and Bluey entered the garage, pulled the bung from a barrel, and poured what was left of the wine from the bottle into the barrel to replenish the angel's share. Inside, they found Sheila slumped in a chair, eyes closed, mouth open, asleep. Over at Cougar Winery, Carrie Ann was thinning her vines, and Miguel's crew weed-whacked. They gathered all the clippings and scrub into a pile and ran it through a mulcher she purchased that cut leaves, stems, branches, and twigs into bite-sized chunks and fed the beast of her compost pile, from which steam rose as the sun set and temperatures dropped. Later in spring, the vines came of age, with the females flowering and the males extending above the top wire, and Paul, after regaining his sense of smell, became intoxicated by his floral heaven, and his thoughts detoured to the muse who restored his sense. Rabbits are death to baby vines, but grow tubes solved that problem. Still, there were more plagues in a vineyard than biblical Egypt. Grasshoppers large as hummingbirds devouring new shoots. At least there's next year's for that vine. If you're careful, a grasshopper can get you killed. Bluey loved to snap at them, and they must taste good since the Chinese eat them, but they're not easy to catch. Paul saw a large one on a vine. He snipped at its hard shell with his clippers and still managed to fly 2 rows away. How did it survive that? You can crush them with your feet. Good practice for the I Love Lucy grape stomp. But grasshoppers have good eyes, see your foot coming, and are in the air before the hammer hits the ground. Paul swung his shovel, and the grasshopper took off in advance of the blade. Paul and Bluey chased it. Whack! And a series of gong chimes reverberated through the vineyard as Paul swung and missed, and the metal shovel clanged against the ground. Paul spotted it, moved into position, and swung, but the grasshopper was back in the air, another miss. Paul followed it, right over a curled snake who didn't have time to get off a rattle before he was sliced in two. There was no time for Paul to think. His instinct was to swing, especially with Bluey behind him. Paul severed the head to finish the job. That was enough grasshopper chasing for one day. He brought Bluey back to the house and went back up to the hill to bury the viper before Sheila. Grasshoppers could damage a vine, but sharpshooters could wipe out your whole vineyard by spreading Pierce's disease. Sharpshooters are easier to catch than grasshoppers with the right technique. The sharpshooter is keenly aware of where you are and hides behind the shoot as you approach. If you move your hand to the far side of the shoot, the sharpshooter scuttles in front of you where you can catch it with your other hand or clap it between both hands to smash it. Slugs and snails are a nuisance, but generally not a serious threat, except to baby vines and grow tombs. Frogs croak at the end of winter rains, but never reach plague proportions, although one might hop from the outside grill when opened. Our exit off the 15 is called Deer Springs Road, but I've never seen a deer here, thank goodness, because they're so destructive to vineyards in other parts of the country. Deer and bear eat what's above ground, while gophers kill vines, rose bushes, and fruit trees underground, anything with roots. Gophers would claim victory over the first rose bush given to Paul and Sheila, their first vine, and the last kiwi planted by the estate's founder. Each year, they claimed several vines. Still, there was a more dangerous threat, constantly lurking, that could wipe out your grapes. With the return of warmer weather, Paul rejoiced, taking outside showers, and recharging his body's vitamin D by toweling himself dry under the sun. He was finally beginning to thaw out, for his California home was not well insulated. So poorly, in fact, he felt more comfortable in Minnesota in January than San Diego, because Minneapolis hotels were well insulated and heated. His house was not, and they couldn't afford a new furnace after buying the house, installing the vineyard, and paying for college tuition. The quickest way to warm up on a crisp morning was to work outside. Temperatures were cool in San Diego from Thanksgiving through February, which coincided with the rainy season. So when winter dissolved into spring, Paul was happy as he thought. So were the mildew guys. Have you ever met someone who didn't want temperatures to rise above 70 Fahrenheit degrees? For my friends in the rest of the world, that's 21°C for 6 continuous hours. Why so precise? Because the University of California, Davis researched this extensively. If you're comfortable outside, so are the mildew guys, explained Carrie Ann, who studied the university's ICPM, that's Integrated Pest Management, report on mildew and the scientific mildew index, which showed the correlation between temperatures and mildew infestation. As temperatures increased above 70 degrees, so does mildew pressure, and she tapped into the local weather observatory to track daytime temperatures by hour, so she knew exactly when to spray to prevent it. She, Paul, and most vineyard owners spray to prevent powdery mildew, which is cancer for grapes. And if Paul found a cluster with mildew, he cut it and got it out of the vineyard into a green waste bin at the edge of the property and sprayed the area with organic JMS stylite oil to kill the fungus, once getting the mixture wrong and killing the vines he sprayed along with the mildew. Organic pesticides you can use include stylite oil and caligreen to combat mildew after infection has started. But it's so much better to stay ahead of the game because infected grapes are ruined. There's always mildew lurking in the vineyard. The trick is to prevent it from gaining a strong foothold. Springtime, the vines are young, innocent virgins, so pure, so fresh, that spraying is a rite of passage. Their bat mitzvah, their first communion. At the end of May, Bluey and Paul patrolled the vineyard for any sign of mildew. The spray guy Paul hired told him, "Don't worry, I'm a professional. and Paul took that as a cue for extra vigilance. He sent the canine unit on patrol to hunt down mildew guys as temperatures spiked to the mid-80s, comfortable enough for Paul to sleep with the window open, comfortable enough for the mildew guys to make their move. Paul approached the jungle of row 7 carefully, not knowing what booby traps the enemy had planted. Slowly, methodically, he inspected each vine for signs of the enemy. Paul stopped. Bluey stopped, wagged the stub of his wiggle butt. "Good boy," said Paul, and he tossed the canine a treat. He slowly pulled back a leaf, and there it was, so noticeable as frost on a pumpkin, white as snow in winter, as clear as a line of cocaine. Bluey lifted his snout to check the aroma. The dog didn't have the vocabulary to describe the smell of a humid room in southern Alabama without air conditioning in summer, never washed with Clorox. The scent of an unshaven woman, Carrie Ann used to describe Jenny Lee's furry kitten. An aroma of hopelessness, Paul learned after years as a gentleman farmer. It was simply the scent of scrapes infected with creeping death that starts out pretty as snowflakes and turns black as the fruit is ruined. The scent Paul trained his dog to detect, the mortal enemy of the vineyard. He texted it as proof to the self-proclaimed professional spray guy paid to keep mildew out of the vineyard. Paul snipped the infection in the bud with his clippers, sipping the tiny grape bunch from the vine and isolating it from other grapes like a pariah Ebola patient, and prepared for combat.